Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seventh seminar in this COVID-19 seminar series, co-hosted by the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation and the Deakin Science and Society Network. My name's Tim Neal. I'm a DECRA Senior Research Fellow at Deakin University and Deputy Convener of the Science and Society Network, an initiative to support interdisciplinary research. I'd like to begin this session first by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing in this particular bit of Melbourne, Australia, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the indigenous traditional owners of all the places that you, our audience, are listening from and our speakers are speaking from. For those of you who have not attended one of the COVID-19 seminars to date, I'll just give you a quick rundown on the structure for today's event on seeing Indigenous land struggles in COVID-19. In a moment, I'll introduce our speakers, who are all going to give short presentations on their research, and then we'll move to some discussion and Q&A. I'll be chairing the discussion here on Zoom, and my colleague Tao Fan will be moderating the YouTube live chat. We're very keen to hear and answer your questions. So you can either post the questions in the YouTube chat, you can send them on to us at Twitter. We are at SSN Deakin. Or you can also email them to us, which is our email address is ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. Okay, well, without further ado, I'll just introduce our speakers before handing it over to them. Our first speaker, Will Smith, is an Associate Research Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University. He's an anthropologist and human geographer whose research critically explores environmental governance, indigenous livelihoods, and climate change in the Philippines. He's the author of the upcoming book, Mountains of Blame, Climate and Culpability in the Philippine Uplands, which will be published by University of Washington Press later this year. Noah Theriault is an assistant professor of anthropology at Carnegie Mellon University, and he studies global scale forces and how they shape the lives of rural and urban communities in the Philippines, with particular attention to the everyday practices through which those forces are enacted, contested, and potentially transformed. This includes a long-term study of indigeneity and biodiversity conservation in Palawan, and more recently, a political ecology of infrastructure in Manila. And then our third speaker, June Rubis, is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Sydney. She has extensive experience with wildlife conservation fieldwork in both Indonesian and Malaysian Borneo, as well as experience with indigenous land rights issues in Malaysian Borneo, working alongside and with local activists on campaigns to resist mega dam developments. She studies decolonial indigenous approaches to biodiversity conservation in Sarawak, and much of her approach to her work follows along the teachings of her late Bidyo father. So those are our three speakers. I'm very pleased to chair today's conversation. I'm looking very much forward to the discussion. And so I'll hand it over to our speakers.
Great, thanks, Tim. So this presentation is a very small expansion of a cultural anthropology editors forum article that Noah and I wrote a few weeks ago. So thanks to the SSN for giving us a platform to collaboratively think through some of these ideas in more detail and engage in some productive dialogue together. So what I want to do here is just set up some framing for Noah and June, who will talk in more detail about a couple of different case studies in Southeast Asia. So the focal point of the cultural anthropology piece and the seminars today are the narratives surrounding Indigenous people in the current pandemic crisis within both popular and academic discourse. So there are, I think, two broad kinds of narratives in this space at the moment that speak to some really important issues, but also do some problematic political work that warrants some critical investigation. So the first and probably most prominent kind of representation is the victimization of Indigenous peoples, and this is seen in a spate of articles in public health policy and scholarly attention that focuses on the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 might have on remote communities throughout the world. So Indigenous peoples in Australia, the United States, Canada, and many other places have all been singled out as uniquely vulnerable. So this reporting, an academic concern, has also obsessively focused in particular on Amazonian communities and on contacted tribes, and COVID-19 reporting in the region has become a site where older tropes about indigenous isolation have become reproduced even within very progressive reporting. So this is an article, for instance, that appeared quite recently in The Guardian. So to be clear, the differentiated capabilities of humans to respond to the biological and economic impacts of pandemics is a very important story to tell, and the vulnerability of many indigenous communities is very real. However, the recurring prominence of this framing positions indigenous people very much on the peripheries of the world system and is completely outside the material and symbolic circuits from which this particular coronavirus has emerged. So the second narrative concerns efforts to explore COVID-19's nebulous and increasingly convoluted origins in a range of animals that seem quite exotic to Western eyes and palates, so bats, civets, birds, and many others. The emergence of the coronavirus has focused tremendous scholarly and media attention on practices and places within what Theriault has very aptly referred to as the multispecies cloud of zoonotic disease emergence. So within this cloud, thinking through the relationships between humans and particular non-humans has allowed for provocative troubling of notions of emergence and causality and implicates a very wide range of actors and spaces. So Chinese wet markets, the work of genetic analysis, international wildlife trafficking, deforestation, industrial agriculture. So perhaps the most widespread and emblematic example of this kind of analysis comes in the form of the pangolin. So one of the creatures that's been identified in ongoing genetic analysis as the possible ultimate origin of this virus. So thanks to our collective obsession with the pangolin, manifest in the widespread dissemination of stock photography that accompanies many popular and academic articles, including the piece that we wrote for Cultural Anthropology, which featured a critically endangered Philippine pangolin, which is included here. We will all likely hold a broad and shared understanding of this animal at a very basic level. So pangolins are a uniquely scaled and threatened mammal found throughout tropical Asia and Africa. They're valued for their meat and scales within many traditional medicines. And because of the increasing economic heft of Chinese consumers, they're considered to be the most widely trafficked animal in the world. So thinking through the pandemic with pangolins has allowed the construction of a very popular and persuasive argument. The ultimate origin of the pandemic does not lie in a virus, but in our negative relationship with the environment. More environmental destruction brings humans closer and into more dangerous contact with animals that operate as disease reservoirs, resulting in the proliferation of potential sites of disease transfer from animals to humans. So illegal wildlife trafficking in particular is seen as particularly symptomatic of a broken and damaging relationship with the non-human world. However, what we suggest here is that paying attention to pangolins and other striking animals operates as a kind of more than humanish fetishism that posits a largely universal and undifferentiated humanity, and in doing so minimizes or erases reference to people who actually coexist with these animals, and whose life worlds, livelihoods, and political struggles are often intimately bound up with the extraction or protection of these creatures in very complex ways. So there is a need, I would suggest, to kill these fetishes. So this is an image of a frozen pangolin removed from wildlife traffickers in the Philippines, and it's striking because it speaks to the more troubling relations that surround pangolins and other trafficked animals in locations where they actually live. So killing fetishes doesn't entail ignoring these creatures or their more than human relations that surround them, but instead grappling with the complex and place-specific dynamics that surround sites where fetishized animals actually live and are extracted from. So this isn't only a moral imperative that privileges mostly ignored indigenous perspectives, but it's an empirical corrective that can help actually better explain zoonotic disease emergence. So to explore some of these dynamics, the seminar is really focused in its attention on the forests of Southeast Asia, which are some of the most biodiverse places on Earth, key source of wildlife that ends up in places like the wet markets of Wuhan, and are also the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples from throughout the regions. While these forested areas are cast in the popular imagination as remote or peripheral to global change, these landscapes and their inhabitants have been brokers of the world system and have had prominent roles in the production or extraction of world-changing commodities such as paper and rubber. So this historical framing found in the work of anthropologists like Michael Dove and others argues that rather than marginal, indigenous peoples in the region have been key actors in globalizing processes for centuries. The international wildlife trade that supplies markets like those in Wuhan is only the most recent manifestation of this kind of dynamic. So as in centuries past, the forests of Southeast Asia and the more than human communities they contain play key roles in the commodity chains that tightly braid indigenous struggles for land and livelihood to really pivotal moments of global change. So to flesh out this kind of discussion, both Noah and June will explore some of these dynamics across Palawan Island in the Philippines and Malaysia and Borneo. So with that, I will pass things over to Noah.
Well, thank you so much, Will. And I also want to echo your thanks to the Science and Society Network, to Tim and to Tao for making this possible. And in keeping with the spirit of the topic that we're talking about today, I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as the Lenape people's ancestral lands. And I was born and raised on Tohono O'odham lands in what is now by the settler state called Arizona, Southern Arizona. I myself am a settler on those lands, was a settler on those lands. So I wanted to pick up where Will left off, talking about Palawan as a place and as a piece in this larger multi-species cloud or puzzle, whatever metaphor you want to use, that we've been experiencing over the past several months. So I begin with this image here, which I took from a wall in Puerto Princesa, the capital city of Palawan, painted by local artists. This is outside of a school. And I didn't include the whole thing, but you can see here the artist expressing concern with extraction and its effects on the environments. And if you go further down the panel, on human communities in Palawan, but also the people responding to try to heal the earth and challenge this destructive extractivism. And chances are, if you've ever heard of Palawan outside of critical academic work like Will's or my own, you've heard Palawan probably described uncritically as the last frontier. And it has gotten this sort of designation, this very misleading and I would argue harmful designation, as a result of its history being sort of at the interstices of various polities over time, from the Muslim trading states that dominated the southern Philippines and parts of the northern Philippines in more ancient times, through the Spanish Empire, the American Empire, etc. Palawan was sort of, in some ways, distinct in that its forests weren't plundered to the same extent, and it wasn't settled as heavily by either people from other regions or people from within the Philippines once that emerged as a state. This last frontier terminology obscures, of course, both the history that Will alluded to of indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia playing a very important role for centuries in global trade networks and in the rise and fall of polities, but it also obscures the ongoing reality of what it really means to be a frontier. Whose frontier are we talking about here? What story is embedded in that? And to make a really long story short, what's happening in Palawan today, I would say, is best described as a frenzy. A frenzy on the one hand, driven by, for several decades now, since around the middle of the 20th century, settlement from other parts of the Philippines. The state has really tried to push people to so-called frontiers like Mindanao and Palawan as a way of both bringing those areas within the control of the state, but also relieving demographic pressure elsewhere, as well as extraction. So we're thinking deforestation, mining, monocrop plantations, deforestation as in logging, I should say, tourism, and more recently also conservation and efforts by the government to gain control of its geobody, of this territory that, at least in the government's imagination, is often beyond the reach of the state. And so this frenzy of corporate, government, and non-governmental actors coming together there really puts the island's indigenous populations in a rather difficult position, caught on the one hand between efforts to control their labor, their land, their resources, and the other to protect their land, but also, of course, to control it at the same time. And the way that this manifests in most cases is in the form of, on the one hand, protected areas. So there's been a proliferation of protected areas on Palawan, starting around the 1990s, when it became very symbolic place in the minds of conservationists, both within the Philippines and globally. Both Will and I have done extensive field work within a protected area, the Mount Mantaldinghan protected area in the south. This also has manifested in an rapid expansion, in addition to what I mentioned with mining, more recently in monocrop plantations. So on the one hand, indigenous peoples there, like the Batak, the Tagbanwa, and the Palawan, find themselves pressured to sell their land or lease their land to monocrop plantations. On the other hand, they find themselves pressured to consent to conservation regimes that may not actually benefit them in a substantial way. In fact, may cause them significant disadvantage in the long run. So just to give you some examples of what this struggle looks like, so you can imagine on the one hand, monocrop plantations and forest clearance for the sake of monocrop plantations. But the other way in which it manifests, which may be a little bit less obvious, is in the discrimination against indigenous livelihood practices. So here we have an image from a TV report about kaingin, which is the Tagalog word for swidden, or sometimes pejoratively referred to as slash and burn agriculture. In indigenous languages of Palawan, it's known as uma. And here, this news report is telling us that indigenous swidden is the main cause of deforestation. And here's an example of 200 hectares of Palawan's forests being destroyed by indigenous swidden. Now, anyone who's familiar with sort of state minority relations in Southeast Asia will know that this is a familiar trope. This is a pattern across the region of upland peoples, forestry management practices, agricultural practices being blamed for deforestation, when in fact it's often their practices that are responsible for the forest, such as conservationists imagine them and want to protect them. In the second image on this page here, you see a poster. I took this poster in the municipal hall in a southern Palawan municipality, informing anyone looking at it that capturing, harming, killing, selling, and exporting of wildlife is strictly forbidden. And my attention was actually drawn to this poster by a leader in the Palawan community who had seen it and was really concerned because a lot of the things that are pictured on there, particularly the Palawan bearded pig, are things that people rely on for livelihood, things that are spiritually significant, things that they hunt and gather as part of their quote unquote traditional practices, and that they've been hunting, gathering, eating, coexisting with, as the cliche says, since time immemorial. So they're faced with this reality of, say they choose to not sign on to it, whether they have a choice or not. So say somehow monocrop plantations, mines, extractive industries don't push them off their land and convert it to whatever purposes they have for it. Oftentimes their other choice then is to cooperate with, or their other reality, conservation enclosures. And these are the sorts of images and narratives that come along with that. The reality, of course, for the lives of the people who I've spent time with in Southern Palawan, my Palawan hosts, is that their relationships with the environment are intimate relationships. When you make your living off the land, whether through farming, hunting, or gathering, you have a very different, oftentimes, relationship with the other organisms and the land itself than you would living in the sort of urban environment that I live in, where I buy my food at the supermarket. I don't ever have to actually have a direct firsthand relationship with the plants and animals that I consume. And when I was trying to decide what story to tell to sort of illustrate what this looks like in practice, I thought on the one hand about the way dispossession and forest clearance and people's loss of their land drives the wildlife trade by making people sort of desperate for income and thus willing to let extractive industries basically do whatever they want, and sometimes to exploit their own labor in the process, right? The wildlife trade for things like pangolins in places like Palawan is absolutely driven by dispossession, right? It is a form of extraction that goes along with monocrop plantations, mining, et cetera, et cetera. And people's sort of co-optation of their labor as participants, voluntary or not, in that trade is part of their larger, I would say, proletarianization. But the story that I actually want to tell has to do with a different kind of relationship to the land. And so if you look to the image furthest to the left of the pangolin on a person's arm, I took that image while I was visiting the house of a Palawan family that I visited frequently because they were, really interested in talking about the things that they were dealing with in terms of land change, but also interested, this particular family, in talking about Palawan, I guess, stories, for lack of a better word, what they call the tuturan at kagurang-gurangan, the sort of stories of the ancestors, which is not something that people at university interested in talking about. In this case, while I was there, a young child, probably age 10 or so, brought home the pangolin that is pictured there. And by this point, I had noticed that children would sometimes randomly bring home wildlife that they would encounter. Sometimes they would be learning to hunt, and it would emerge from that kind of an experience. In this case, I think the child encountered this presumably juvenile pangolin while hunting, gathering, playing somewhere on the landscape, somewhere in the forest, and decided to bring it home. And when I first saw this practice, I had originally assumed that it was associated with perhaps the wildlife trade, perhaps with some imminent harm coming to the animal, if not hunting. But I came to learn that, in fact, in this area, people were not participating in the wildlife trade. And this was instead sort of tolerated by the older generation, or even perhaps encouraged as a way for children to develop more knowledge of their landscape. It wasn't that kids were constantly bringing home wildlife, but when they did, they weren't scolded as I would have been as a child for doing that, because it's a different way of thinking about what it means to relate to the land, to so-called wildlife. And the father of this child told me a story about how an ancestor of theirs had encountered a pangolin in the forest once during a drought. And pangolins are nocturnal. This pangolin was out during the day. That led the man, rather than try to hunt or harm the pangolin in some way for consuming it, to follow the pangolin to a water source. So the pangolin led the man to a water source, and that became part of this oral tradition about how it is that you learn from other than human beings in your landscape. And now, that's easy story to sort of romanticize. Some of these human-animal relationships are prone to romanticization. That's not my point in bringing it up, but rather to offer an alternative vision of what it can mean to relate to so-called exotic animals when they're not, in fact, exotic to you and are part of the landscape that you live in, that your ancestors have lived in, and that even if those relations don't always look like some kind of mutualistic harmony, they're still intimate relationships, and thus trying to prevent future pandemics, say, by preventing humans from interacting with particular kinds of wildlife is actually counterproductive. So just to conclude briefly then, what I would say in order to advance the conversation around the COVID-19 pandemic and other zoonotic diseases where these kinds of animals are implicated, the first thing is that we need to defend indigenous land rights, defend indigenous livelihoods, that indigenous people's ability to continue relating to their land and to remain on their land is the number one variable, I would argue, in trying to understand how it is that these sorts of pathogens can make their way from somewhere like the forests and communities of Palawan to the markets in China and beyond. But secondly, and in some ways more importantly, I think for people on an individual or interpersonal level, is to remake our relationships with ourselves and with our world so that we're less susceptible to narratives that fetishize exotic wildlife and prescribe somehow protecting those wildlife by severing all of their relationships with humans. And I think there's a risk that in the midst of thinking about preventing future pandemics, we're going to further double down on human exceptionalism, when in fact, I think we need to find alternatives to that if we're going to figure out how to coexist with each other and with the world around us. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. I'd like to start with thanking Thao and Tim and the Science Society Network for inviting me to be part of this forum. And I would also like to acknowledge, well, at least I'm from the Sydney Environment Institute of University of Sydney that sits on Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and I acknowledge all Indigenous peoples. But I'm currently talking to you from Sarawak, where I'm from because of the pandemic lockdown. So when I was asked to be part of this webinar, I was asked to consider, for example, the focus on animals versus relations of these animals or wildlife with Indigenous peoples. So of course, I had to talk about the orangutan. So the orangutan, as we all know, when we think of Borneo, we think of the orangutan, the person of the forest. So what you see on your screen is actually the earliest Western drawing of the orangutan by this Dutch anatomist Tulp in the year 1641. So the orangutan has been like thought of since the 18th century. It's been popular in the Western and East Asian imaginations and legend and philosophical debate. It's been like we see it in our, the fiction that we understand. For example, I think it was Edgar Allan Poe that talks about orangutan. So it's always been an imagination on the West. And in the practices of conservation, the nature and charisma of the orangutan, particularly next to the image of the oil palm plantation expansion its habitats, is mobilized in form of flagships and or iconic or charismatic species to elicit great sympathy and support from funders. So from a biological perspective, orangutans are seen as appropriate as an umbrella text for all other elements of biodiversity, given their large home ranges and the wide range of interactions with the other species in their environment. So both orangutan habitat countries, which is Malaysia and Indonesia, feature orangutans among their tourism attractions. So on the next slide, I think that was a different slide. We had another slide, but that's okay. So I want to talk about orangutan because, I mean, as someone growing up, I was born and raised in Sarawak. And in the 90s, we had all this logging protests that were happening at that time. So there were a lot of Westerners that came down to protest. And that really interested me as a child because none of us, well, at least people in the cities were not interested in what was going on. So the only way to actually think about, when we think about conservation for Sarawak, is to think about the animals, because that's what we were taught, you know, like in terms of like our formalized education. We don't think about the stories that were told to us by our grandparents. So in Sarawak, there was another map because in Sarawak, the wild orangutan population is actually well conserved. It's found in Batangay and Lanjak and Timau, which are, it's a protected area and a wildlife sanctuary, which is about almost 200 square kilometers in size. And with the Indonesian Transboundary National Park next to it, it actually is well conserved. So from the Sarawak's government perspective, the wild orangutan, when we think of conservation, is well conserved. So therefore they could develop the rest of Sarawak. So Sarawak has actually lost 90% of our primary rainforest to logging and has the fastest rate of deforestation in Asia. So Sarawak only has 0.5% of the world's tropical forests, but we accounted for 25% of tropical log exports in 2010. So what's happening in Sarawak right now? Because the focus for conservation is mostly on flagship species like the orangutans, there's little focus on indigenous territorial areas where we don't have such charismatic species. So for example, there's been, since the 90s, there's been a lot of logging that's been going on. And after the logging, we have monoculture plantations. Like, so it's the lands are logged and then planted for monocrops, such as oil palm. And now we're heading into issues where the state says we need to develop for, like the rest of the country, and that means mega dams. And that's a huge issue for indigenous peoples that continue to live on the lands, but do not have animals, like very charismatic species to think about, to excite outside supporters who want to help. So what we have instead, as Will has pointed out, that we end up having the romanticization of indigenous peoples, which could be problematic as well. So it's a story that I always think about, because when we think about wanting to save forests or wanting to save species, it comes from a very Western framework. And even for people like myself, even though I was born and raised in Sarawak, but you went to school where you're taught to sort of forget everything that that your ancestors would have taught you, that your grandparents would have taught you. And we have this idea that's so different than what our peoples would have taught us. I talk about orangutan because one of the stories, the stories that conservation likes to use, is that the Ibans of Batangay actually have, they focus on part of a story that the Ibans have, which is that orangutans help the Ibans give birth safely. So therefore the Ibans are responsible for the orangutans. And the reason why we see orangutans still being killed when in some off and on hunting expeditions is because Ibans have lost their traditional customs. And therefore us, as in conservation peoples, people from the cities, we need to teach them their ways. And for me, that was sort of my turning point of like, we have to think beyond just animals, but also relations with the peoples and the actual realities that they live on the lands. So the story as actually goes on further, and from what I understand from my Iban interlocutors, it's actually more than just saving, it's about more than an orangutan saving Ibans, but that they have what they call like a contract where the orangutans also have to respect their livelihoods. So they, for the Ibans in Batangay, I can use an example because I've heard recently from Australia where they use the idea of totem, which is actually a North American term. So the idea of totem, it's a responsibility that you have towards a species, which means that you do not hunt or kill. And I understand the concept really well because in Sarawak and in Borneo, it's translated as the pantang. So you have a pantang against, for example, the orangutan, or you have a pantang against a pangolin where you're not supposed to kill. And that is inherited by the rest of your descendants. So that is a principle of conservation that is often not actually emphasized when we think about animals and relations with indigenous peoples. For conservation means the romanticized stories tend to be emphasized mostly because it sort of fits into what I think is like sort of a top-down perspective, an NGO model where you're given an opportunity to teach peoples how to conserve, and that is very problematic. So on the next slide. So where do we go from there? I think a couple of points I like to make, and I reiterate Nova's points. Firstly, we should avoid acting on crisis mode. And I think the COVID is a really good example of where we're just sort of jumping in and reacting to the situation. Especially, I think when we think about animals, it's a sense of like, because they're like a symbol of innocence, I mean, especially when you're so far removed from nature, it's so easy to see them as a symbol of innocence. They can do no wrong. Whereas when people who live on the lands with the species just have different relationships with them. So if we start to understand that it's different and we stop imposing our own Western inherited ideas on how they should be treating animals. Noah and I also wrote an article where we talk about defending space for collaborative concealment. So I talked a bit about how the conservation sees orangutans as an example of it's the Iban's responsibility to conserve. So therefore they don't have, you don't have to spend so much on enforcement. You just have to encourage the people on the lands to conserve orangutans themselves. But the Ibans in Batangay have different ways of utilizing these pressures and these ideas, impose them for their own ways to help defend their own native lands. And I think for us as researchers and academics, and when we want to think about the animals, we should start thinking about ways of how do we support the peoples who live on the lands first and are often most marginalized, more so. And you know, we have a sense of responsibility to help them. And therefore, we should restore and advocate for more ethical and just relations. I was thinking, I don't know, I would like to talk about the different ways that we could think about how do we work with animals and how do we work with indigenous people. I think Dr. Zoe Todd from Carleton University, Canada, she is called Dr. Fish Philosopher, and she thinks with the fish, but she thinks with the fish with indigenous peoples. And she always thinks with the fish in terms of like indigenous rights and you know, the responsibilities that we have to uphold these rights. So I think it's about the ways we go about when we think about the animals, when we think about the wildlife, that we have to think with care, that we have to think with the people who are on these lands, who are often most marginalized by the state in different ways, in political, economic, and social ways. And I mean, when I think about it, especially when I think back on my journey, if we can't begin, we can't even begin to think about the most marginalized peoples, how do we even think about the animals? It's not about one is more important than the other, but we're all the same species. I mean, we're all humans, but we cannot consider ourselves as the same responsibility, like someone from the north has the same responsibility as people from indigenous lands. I mean, in terms of the extraction of resources, we have to definitely see the differentiation between these communities, I mean, our communities, and how about can we think about animals in more care, and not just animals, but also of lands and with the peoples that live on the lands. So that's what I'll have to talk about for today. Thank you.
Thanks, June. And thank you to all three of our speakers. So we've got a bit of time for discussion and questions. And as I mentioned at the top of the seminar, and I'll mention again now, if you're following along on the YouTube live chat, you can post your questions in the chat function, and my colleague Tao Fan will forward them through to us. You can also post them on Twitter, either at SSN Deakin, or use the hashtag SSN Seminar, or you can email them to us at ssn-info@deakin.edu.au, and we will get them. But while we're waiting for that, for people to come through, I will maybe put a question to everybody. I guess I got the sense from everybody's seminar that one of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic kind of draws our attention to are the possible responses to the trade in wildlife coming out of, whether it's out of Palawan or Borneo or wherever. And one of those that we'll be familiar with is a kind of biosecurity lockdown. But I guess I'm getting the sense that there's an argument to be made that we would live in potentially a less, more safe, less viral world through the defense of indigenous livelihoods and land first, rather than see that as a thing afterwards. So I was wondering how what kinds of arguments do you think need to be made publicly that are going to join kind of this crisis around viruses to indigenous land struggles? Nobody wants to go first? I'll just nominate somebody. I feel this was kind of your point, Noah, so maybe I'll throw to you first, and then the others can prepare themselves.
Thanks. So I feel like there's two sides to this coin, or many sides, but the two that occurred to me have to do, on the one hand, with more like policy responses, governance, questions of like, if you are seriously thinking about how to prevent zoonotic diseases from becoming pandemics, what sorts of policies make sense for the pandemics or the zoonoses that may come from wild animals like those in the forests of Southeast Asia. And in that case, I absolutely do think that enabling people to self-determine the uses of their land, their labor, and their relationships with the outside world will reduce the extent to which rapacious, unaccountable extraction happens on those lands. And that includes the wildlife trade. Now, of course, people are people. It doesn't matter what ethnicity they are. And there's, I think it would be a mistake to overgeneralize it if just left indigenous people to control their own lands, all the problems would be solved. Of course, the world's more complex than that, but I think that indigenous land rights is the foundation of any policy that is trying to somehow manage or improve zoonotic exposure from those lands. Secondly, though, I think the other side of the coin would be what I alluded to myself, which is like a more interpersonal sort of work, cultural work, not among indigenous peoples, but among people who have prescriptions for what they should do with their land or how these things should be managed. When you've got industrial pig factories, slaughtering animals en masse down the street from you, but you want to, prevent Palawan people from hunting on their own land, I think your moral universe needs to be addressed first before you start telling other people what to do.
Will, you are muted.
We should have developed some kind of system for answering in sequence with so many presenters. I mean, I can only agree with Noah. I think, obviously, indigenous people's land rights should be at the forefront of the response to so many of these environmental and human health ills. I suppose my only point to play kind of devil's advocate here is that I think there's some potential danger, I suppose, surrounding the co-optation of biosecurity concerns within existing governmental apparatus in Palawan or elsewhere. So NGOs or government agencies taking up this kind of cause for biosecurity and deploying that in many ways probably against the interests of indigenous people. So I guess there's just always a need to balance the optimistic, how we construct these arguments and the power they might do beyond our own intentions. And I guess that's something that we all need to keep in mind as we attempt to craft these public relations kind of responses to moments like this.
Well, I guess I'd like to bring us back, to Malaysia in the 90s during the Nipah virus. So we've all heard about the Nipah virus. So that was like one of the prominent pandemics that happened. That could have been a lot worse, but it was actually contained by the Malaysian government. It actually came from a bat. The bats were eating the fruit trees around the pig farms, and it was dropping on the ground, and all the pigs were eating it. So that is a zoonotic disease. But I think what's also forgotten is that the reason why the bats had moved closer to the pig farms was that there was like massive deforestation prior. So like where the bats would have normally gone, they couldn't anymore. So they had shifted to where the pig farms were, where these fruit trees are. So when we go back again, and again, where this deforestation happens, it happens on indigenous lands. We also have to remember, like, indigenous peoples account for like less than 5% of the total human population, and yet they hold, or they maintain tenure on about 25% of lands, which hold about 80% of the world's biodiversity. So again, we go back into like, what sort of relations should we have, and how do we support indigenous peoples who continue to live on the lands? I mean, I agree with Will, when you think about biosecurity, it's just sort of like the usual actors and the ways of how we try to control people with less rights, and how the blame then just sort of gets shifted down. It's never our fault, it's someone else's fault. And I think when we start thinking, like Will argues about in terms of animals, it's like, again, whose fault is it? it becomes like the other, the exotic wet markets and so forth. So these are things that I think we should consider.
Thanks, June. So we've got a couple of questions coming through from YouTube, and the first one is from our colleague at Deakin University, Alex Roginski, who says thank you to the panel, and was wondering about what have been the responses from the Philippines regarding pangolins and COVID-19. I guess we didn't really cover that. How is, I guess, on one hand, the pangolin element of COVID-19 played out in the Philippines, and perhaps the pandemic itself?
Maybe I can just make a quick point about, as far as I understand, there's been no specific response to pangolins, but just recently the Department of Environment and Natural Resources banned the trade in all non-timber forest products coming out of forests like Palawan. And so part of this was to kind of prevent a dramatic and sudden reaction to this crisis, to try and prevent further zoonotic disease transfer. But obviously it has huge implications for indigenous people whose livelihoods rely on the trade in these resources, legal and or illegal. So I think what this kind of points to is that there's a potential for a lot of damage to be done in terms of preventing further zoonotic disease transfers from emerging, using that justification for these really significant changes to how people live their lives. Yeah, maybe Noah might have something else to add.
Yeah, so I have also seen the reports about efforts to sort of clamp down generally on NTFPs, which ironically will make the problem worse by further impoverishing people. NTFPs, while that industry as a whole is very extractive as well and often over extracts, it's one of the primary sources of income and sometimes a way that indigenous communities can actually defend their land tenure by having some resources of their own. And so it's alarming to see that being part of the response. I've also seen some people saying that the lockdown is the best thing that ever happened to pangolins because at least for the moment, there's been much less, extraction. My own, I guess, prognosis is that things are going to fairly quickly return to how they were before, with maybe some less demand on the Chinese side and other export market side because of crackdowns there. But yeah, I don't see the fundamental nature of the situation changing much. And I think that a focus on NTFPs is not only harmful to indigenous peoples, but from a law enforcement standpoint, unlikely to succeed because people are smarter than that. The organized syndicates, crime syndicates that are doing this are not using rattan exports to hide the pangolins. They're using other things where you wouldn't look for it, I think, in my experience, which is fairly limited, but it's more complicated than just cracking down on things that come out of the forest. Think other kinds of goods that you would never imagine being intermingled with that kind of stuff. And so I think until they really take it on as an organized crime problem and really go after the networks themselves, there's not going to be a long-term change there.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more questions, and I'll go to the next one from another colleague, Jay Okini, who asks, following on from Dr. Rubis's great discussion of charisma, I guess in relationship to charismatic species, charismatic conservation species, I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on how charisma is playing out in the representations of pangolins and zoonotic diseases origins broadly. So I guess not just COVID-19 perhaps, but other zoonotic diseases and how charisma kind of plays in. Anybody want to volunteer? Will,
Well,
you should.
I guess as I kind of talked about, what I think is interesting about the pangolins is they are so uniquely charismatic. Everyone who talks about them, one of the first things they mention is how adorable and cute they are. And you can see that in the stock photography that is really circulated very prominently. And I guess the point that I was trying to make is that this charisma does, the work of obscuring some very messy and complicated relations between humans and non-humans that lie behind that. I think that's something that's really played out very prominently within the current crisis. And yeah, I think it definitely has applicability to future. Definitely has applicability to future issues. And I guess the lesson that you could take away from that is the need to look beyond the enchantment of these animals, if that's possible. Is that possible? I don't know. That's a question to consider, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, charisma, and also charisma to whom. I think people would have different feelings about the pangolins, depending on who you are and where you're from. Charisma is very much, I think it comes, westernized society of how we see these animals. I mean, I think pangolins are really cute. But I think, again, it, like Will says, it distracts us from the wider issues. It's not just animals living in a vacuum. Everything's living together. And that's why it's so important to always focus on the relationships and the lands, like people's on the lands. And maybe in some ways people feel like, oh, because we've talked about it so much, or, we understand the issue and now we want to talk about the animals. But it's rather frustrating, because I think in a lot of ways, coming from a conservation background, you're always talking about the animals in that extent. And it's always very charismatic animals. And it doesn't seem to be helping the issue either. So it's just like, sort of like, what are the ways that we can continue to think about these issues that could help the peoples that are actually protecting the biodiversity and supporting the rest of us from further zoonotic diseases?
I just have a small follow-up with Noah, if I can. I never really encountered many pangolins in my fieldwork on Palawan, and I guess what I'm kind of curious about is how people perceive pangolins and how they relate to them in a little bit more detail, because I guess that we have for most people, they encounter them through this stock photography, and they have a very specific idea of what pangolins are like and how we should relate to them. But I think what's interesting is to kind of look at how people themselves actually relate to these animals in a very kind of grounded way.
So I think I went into my own fieldwork predisposed by like Mary Douglas's writing on pangolins and trying to figure out why they were a taboo animal in the context of her research in sub-Saharan Africa. And, she comes up with, of course, like a structuralist argument about how they don't fit into whatever category, so therefore they're taboo. And what I find, or what I found in the communities that I lived with, is that there was no like universally declared taboo on almost anything, but that included pangolins. People had their own idiosyncratic, sometimes cosmologically explained, but still idiosyncratic taboos of all different kinds. But at least in the community that I spent most of my time with, pangolins were not like an everyday thing that you encountered. They tend to live in, the forests that are, let me put it this way, further away from the lowlands, right? Where they're less likely to encounter humans and get hunted or sold. So my own experience, like yours, is fairly limited. But my impression, based on my experience, was that, while people had stories about them like they do about virtually every aspect of the landscape, there wasn't a particular sacrality or spiritual distinction assigned to them that wouldn't have applied to a lot of other than human beings that you relate to in different ways. I don't want to overgeneralize, but that was my impression.
Thanks, everybody. I had a question actually myself. This seminar is supported by the Science and Society Network, and something we're quite interested in is how different kinds of knowledge, including scientific knowledge, kind of interact with other kinds of knowledge, maybe local knowledge, traditional knowledge. And I guess something I'm interested in is the role of scientists and scientific researchers in these kinds of spaces. Historically, I know a lot of ecological science has been enrolled in kind of forms of what's called fortress conservation, where scientists just kind of see the charismatic species or the biodiversity, can't see the biodiversity for the humans who live amongst it and support it. So I guess I'm kind of curious, as somebody who doesn't know very much about these contexts, what role do scientists and scientific researchers kind of play in these spaces, and are they kind of supportive or perhaps not supportive of the kinds of arguments that you're making? Big question. I will nominate somebody to go first rather than we all speak at once, maybe. June, do you have a
well, I think looking back, I'm just thinking in terms of conservationists, and I've seen a change in terms of how they see people like on the lands that they work on, like either indigenous or local communities. And I think there's more of a growing respect, or at least more of a growing understanding that they can't run away without working with the communities other than just using them as labor for their surveys. So there's a move to integrate indigenous peoples and into their studies, but I think it's still an ongoing process in terms of respect, like actual respect, and where it's not just ad hoc, or it's not just sort of adding them on because you think it's important. I think it's also a personal process. You know, it's something that's you're not going to get by doing ethical forms or you know, following previous surveys. It's like a journey that you have to take on. And I always appreciate, for example, someone like Noah. Like Noah always emphasizes his roots, always acknowledges where he's from and how he does work in Palawan. I mean, as long as I've known him. And it's that personal journey that I think scientists or researchers have to go through, that that you have to reckon with yourself. Like, where are you from? Like, you're from Australia, but which lands are you from? It's just sort of like, if you acknowledge indigenous peoples that you're living on, can you also acknowledge those who, you know, that you do research on, sort of thing. So I guess that's my perspective. But like I said, I mentioned Zoe Todd. She gives like a really good example. So you could read up on her work on how she does work with fish. So she likes to think with fish, but she thinks with indigenous peoples and through her Métis indigenous background as well. I just saw this recent book that was advertised by Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumps, and it's got a really great title. It's called Black Feminist Thought from Marine Mammals. And I'm not quite sure what it's about because it's just out, but it looks really intriguing. So I think there's a lot of researchers out there with different backgrounds trying to think with animals or with biodiversity. And I'm actually quite interested to see what comes from there. But again, like always emphasizing about, we have to acknowledge like the rights and how do we support the rights of indigenous peoples to protect our lands.
Noah, you're next on my screen.
Will, have you heard much from the scientific community since COVID started in Palawan? I personally have not, but my sense is that, as June was saying, you know, many people who do work anywhere in the world, but I'm more familiar with the Palawan context, biodiversity conservationists, whether they're from the Philippines or from abroad, often do have transformative experiences actually engaging with the communities who coexist with the ecosystems or the species they're trying to protect. But the structure of scientific knowledge production and the way that gets translated into policy, particularly around conservation, remains overdetermined, I would say, by the same sorts of assumptions that it has maybe not always been, because things do change, but you know, that you're looking for the highest concentrations of biodiversity, and therefore you do X, Y, or Z. There isn't, you know, necessarily an acknowledgement of a full acknowledgement of the complexity that underlies those kinds of relationships. And, you know, I think every discipline makes its simplifications, including the ones that we belong to. But I think that in some ways, unfortunately, the disciplines that have the greatest power when it comes to thinking about things like conservation or how you protect, say, a pangolin from exploitation, that those disciplines are not necessarily well equipped to deal with the complex lived realities of people in the forests of Palawan or wherever else.
Yeah, I think I kind of really echo Noah there, perhaps a bit more indelicately. I suppose Palawan's kind of an interesting place because it has this reputation as this ecological frontier and this reputation as a place of incredible biodiversity. And I think that does this incredible work of enchantment, even if it isn't specific animals, which are quite often it is, but this notion of like dense biodiversity is really alluring for ecological scientists. And I was talking to a foreign ecologist last year, and they had this kind of draw towards Palawan, wanting to go there and work there and conduct research to have this transformative effect on environmental protection. But absent from their discussion in its entirety was the people who lived there and how they lived in these particular places and the knowledge that they might have about their environments. So I think, you know, as Noah suggests, you should always reflect on your biases in your discipline and not be too pessimistic and recognize that things do change. But at the same time, these are still ideas that are out there and having a really powerful effect on how knowledge is produced.
So we've had a question come through from Emma Caval, our convener of the Science and Society Network. And Emma asks, how have indigenous peoples that you study been affected by COVID-19 and or the lockdown? And I suppose it's very recent and you may not necessarily have, obviously nobody's been conducting any field work recently, but if you have any sense of how they've been affected by the lockdown, has it cut them off from some of the global economic systems that you were each pointing to, and perhaps are there, good or bad kinds of effects that you can see from being cut off from, I guess, circulations of extraction?
Well, I'll go first then. So Malaysia had one of the swiftest response to COVID. So like within a day or two of an announcement, it was a complete lockdown. Like you were not allowed to go out. Like it was pretty drastic. So Sarawak, where I'm from, the Malaysian state of Borneo, what happened was that they said logging was, what do you call it? Important industry. What's that word? Yeah, so that continued. So logging continued, and some parts of oil palm processes continued, as even though there was a lockdown where we were not even allowed to go out of our houses, and you would be arrested under the MCO if you were locked out. So that was quite dire. So indigenous peoples were sort of like from the lands, you could not go anywhere, but that was fine in that sense because they also governed themselves, their communities. But logging and also oil palm processes were still going to some extent, because I was being seen as an essential industry. That's the word I was looking for. It was seen as an essential industry along with hospitals. So talking to an elder the other day, it's fine when you live on the lands, and it's fine for the peoples who still have lands that they protect, that are able to then find food for themselves. They have their own farms and such. So that was quite fine. They were not allowed, there were roadblocks everywhere, so you were not allowed to go into towns. And that could be dire for some people, because for health services, that is very difficult when you live in the rural areas and you have to take long distances. So they were most vulnerable in terms of if there was any infections that were going on in the community. So the elder that he told us that what's not interesting was that the people working the plantations. So even though some of the oil palm processes were going on, the foreign workers were also out of work because they were not able to work on these plantations. So that was something that's strange. But he said because they were out of work, they were not allowed, they were starving. So as the weeks had gone on, as the lockdown had continued, they started begging from the local communities, indigenous communities, for food, and they were stealing food. So that had an effect on also on life, because then you couldn't even, you don't even want to go to the police as well, but you had sympathy for the foreign workers, but what could you do? So, so now we're actually on what they call the recovery movement order for until August. So some things have lifted. I think for the communities in rural areas, it was hard because in terms of like, so yes, you could have like food that you could harvest, but for like other like essentials, like for example, like baby, baby formula, you had to go to towns, but then you had to go through roadblocks. So that caused a lot of like disruption in terms of their lives. And yeah, so it was pretty dire and different, especially in the beginning.
So ironically, the only time that anyone from the community that I work most closely with in Palawan has ever contacted me on the internet was after the lockdown started there. Nobody at the time of my main field work was online there, partially because there isn't really data service, let alone even voice cell phone service. But you can, if you're really determined, you can get some access. And so I've been able to be in touch a bit through that medium with them, and it's a complicated question to answer, because on the one hand, like June was saying, people have certain kinds of resources in that context that people in other contexts may not have, like some food security from growing some of their own food, some ability to get by without earning money every day. But that doesn't mean that you don't freak out when that happens to you too, and that you don't experience a significant decline in your caloric intake or your access to medicine and things like this. So the sense that I got was that people were really, really worried that they wouldn't be able to earn money. And I think that those concerns went down a little bit over time when, of course, compliance isn't 100%. So I'm sure that there was still earning opportunities that people, thought would be canceled. And also because of the things getting classified as essential or, getting taught, put up with for whatever reason by the authorities, I don't think it has been a devastating blow to people's well-being. But we'll see. It'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. I do know, though, for sure that the non-timber forest product trade was disrupted, but that's not totally unique either. There's times when the permits run out, people go months without being able to sell anything. I think the difference in this case was just that it was like all of your sources of income kind of at least stopping temporarily at once, and that is a pretty alarming and unfamiliar thing for everyone, really, but including them.
I mean, I have no firsthand kind of insights about what's going on in economic terms at the moment, but I think what Noah mentioned, this halt on the non-timber forest product trade is really, whether it's having a significant impact now or not, really hints at perhaps some broader impacts that might be coming in the future in terms of governmental policy. So we can only watch, I think, but it's the impacts are likely to be quite negative, I think, on people.
I want to invite the speakers to ask each other questions if they want, but I also have another question. For those who aren't maybe particularly familiar with the context of the Philippines, Malaysian Borneo, Indonesian Borneo, what is the scope, I guess, politically for some of the things we're talking about in terms of expanded legal or political recognition of Indigenous people's rights? Are things pretty much locked in place, or is there significant potential for change? We're going to go in the default order again, perhaps, unless anybody wants to volunteer.
I guess I can volunteer. Just a very quick answer for the Philippines is that it has, since the fall of the Marcos regime in the 80s, had some of the most robust laws on the books, particularly for countries in Southeast Asia for indigenous rights. They were never necessarily well implemented in the first place, but under the Duterte administration and with the broader shift back toward authoritarian governance, I think indigenous rights are often just nominal, and in some ways almost backfire in the sense that they can be used to legitimize something like a mining exploration or a mining permit by saying, well, look, we went through the free and prior informed consent process, we got that, probably from some faction of the community, even though other factions were disputing it, and thus we proceed. Indigenous rights legislation in the Philippines have provided tools for advocates and indigenous communities to resist a lot of abuses in ways that maybe they wouldn't have been able to do before. But I think that the odds are getting worse for them to do that going forward rather than getting better.
So for Malaysia, we are a signatory to UNDRIP, which is a UN instrument for the rights of indigenous peoples, but it's not binding. So it's just sort of like an ideal that you uphold to. For Sarawak and Sabah, the states have the rights to the land in terms of how they govern. So it doesn't come from the federal. So you have like this duality where the federal government signs this international instruments, but then the state sort of has the right to decide what they want to do. So in Sarawak, the indigenous people's rights are recognized to some extent, but you always have to prove that the land belongs to you. So the onus is on to like traditional landowners to say that, yes, like they've planted this durian tree, or the grandfather planted this durian tree in 1960. So therefore, this is the boundary, and these are my, these are our lands. So some lands are recognized, but lands always have to be utilized to be recognized. So for example, Pulau Galau, which is like a conservation island, that's a sort of an indigenous way of indigenous recognition of forested areas that they only go in to take out certain non-forest timber species and for hunting. That's not recognized by the state, and that's also very problematic. And often these lands are then taken from are recognized by the state as theirs. And there's always confusion between like the companies and the states and the communities. So when you talk to the communities that are facing these battles in terms of like land encroachment, it's about like a company that's coming in, and from the company's defense, they said, well, we talked to the state and they said it wasn't, it's not owned by the people, or it's not, there are no rights sort of like recognized on this land. So then you have this issue. So the last time I talked to one of my mentors, there's about over 300 court cases that are in the courts right now for indigenous peoples, because what happens is that there's no way to address this properly. I mean, address this in ways that is satisfaction for all parties, including the communities. So they are forced to sue the state, forced to sue the companies. And there's been many headways where the federal court actually recognizes and upholds indigenous lands. And so that's good in some ways, but it's still an ongoing battle. But I think the court cases are really useful because it's a way that sort of focuses like Malaysians living in urban areas, that this is still an ongoing thing. So I think, so that's one of the ways that we can see what's happening in Sarawak. It's through these court cases and also the protests that go on. Now, whether these protests are able to go on during COVID times, and that's another reckoning that we don't know how that would affect also people who are trying to defend their lands from companies and from encroachment.
I don't really have much more to add to Noah's grim assessment of the situation, other than, it's a situation of indigenous people in the Philippines is increasingly worse under the Duterte regime, and indigenous people have been targeted by all kinds of violence for the purposes of resource extraction and agricultural development recently. So the outlook is not good under Duterte.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we might have to leave it on that slightly down note, but I myself feel much more aware and educated about these topics now. So thank you, all three speakers, Will Smith, Noah Theriault, and June Rubis. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us about seeing Indigenous land struggles in COVID-19. For people watching the stream, just a couple of quick notes at the end. We have another seminar this week, not about COVID-19, but actually related to Indigenous people's rights and interests. We have a seminar on Thursday called Present and Future Directions for Cultural Fire. So that's a seminar that's going to focus very much on issues around Indigenous people's fire management here in Australia. And then on June 23rd, Christopher Kelty, a anthropologist, is going to be speaking to us about the history of participation as a idea in the social sciences and government. So a couple more seminars to come. So please do look those up and tune in. Otherwise, thank you everybody for joining, and thank you to our speakers. I hope everyone has a very good rest of their day.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.